So we saw this inevitability marching down the pathway, and at the time, the 3rd Infantry Division, which we were a brigade of, had responsibility for the defense of Kuwait, and should deterrence fail, to counterattack into Iraq. That was essentially the mission we had at the time. And so we had these revolving brigades, and so everybody was looking at the timeline to say, okay, am I going to be in the brigade that's there when this happens? As it turned out, as I recall, the 3rd Brigade from here at Fort Benning deployed on the 1st rotation. And ultimately, in August of 2002, we were named to replace the 3rd Brigade and go to Kuwait. So you arrive in Kuwait, it's August of 2002, and we're going to be on a number of different FOBs or installations there out in the flat desert of Kuwait. Pretty barren, Spartan type environment. But here's what we had. We were going to have 6 months straight, didn't know at the time, but we would have 6 months straight of nothing but maneuver training prior to the invasion in the spring of 2003. And so in terms of training and preparation, I don't think there's been a brigade, a heavy brigade, that has been more trained for a high-intensity maneuver fight like we were in the spring of 2003 because of all the training opportunities we had. What was new was the opportunity to expand our capacity to the full limits of the weapon systems that we had. You know, these weapons, there's a lot of range issues, and you can't just go onto any training post in the United States and unleash Scunyon, you know, as a brigade. A brigade combat team is a large formation with weapon systems that can really reach out. Well, the desert of, you know, if you know what Kuwait's like, it's really a city-state. And so Kuwait City's right there on the coast, but everything north of there is all flat desert. And there's Bedouin tribes out there, but not very many, very Spartan. And so we had the opportunity, like I said, to extend the capacity of this brigade to its very limits. And so by the time, I'd say a month and a half before we deployed, we had this brigade that under very low visibility at night could maneuver the entire brigade, which was 3 maneuver battalions, artillery battalion, on a movement to contact with a turning movement live fire. That is a significant training event that you can't, and we don't do even in the States today. But that was because of the space that we had and the latitude and freedom to train as we needed. In terms of, you know, morale, look here, people by nature, 2 things. They want to be useful and they want to be loved. And you know, the American people were given a lot of support at the time, and they knew they were going to be useful. There's a little bit of, you know, as you're sitting there on the south of a border that seems to be inevitable that you're going to cross, it creates what I would call a level of prudent anxiety, which is just enough stress on the body to make you a high performer. So everybody was in a very high performing mode. And I think if you studied the international dynamics at the time, it was becoming increasingly apparent, and the soldiers would say this, the fastest way home was through Baghdad. And so it was, they knew that redeploying was not going to go south through the port. Redeployment meant going north through Baghdad. And so there was an increasing anticipation, you know, you'd a little bit of concern, but nothing unhealthy. You've got all the brigades. At this time, you had, oh golly, I'm trying to remember, maybe upwards of 150,000 troops. We'd have to go back and check the numbers on that. And, you know, they're stacked into Kuwait. And so whereas we owned the place for the first 6 months, after a while, you had highway signs and everything else moving people around. So then, you know, we deployed out to our tactical assembly areas and then moved closer to right short of line of departure there on the border of Kuwait. And then it became apparent that we were going to kick off that night. I think, as I recall, it was even accelerated by a number of hours due to a Scud attack. And so we accelerated our timeline a bit. But this is what I'll remember. It's a distinct memory. At the time, I was the brigade executive officer, which means I was in the operations center that helped synchronize fires, synchronize movements on the battlefield. We were at a flat map table. The tanks and Brads were up a little bit further forward of us. And the 1st Mech Infantry Company was going to penetrate a border crossing site where there were guard outposts, and the 1st Bradley engaged this border outpost, and remember him reporting back that they'd engaged and destroyed the border outpost to include 3 enemy soldiers who were killed in action, or KIA. But the way the report came across was profound to me. And the reason it was profound was because as I'm looking at this map in the command post with the desert floor, the exact same report in the exact same environment could have been the National Training Center out at Fort Irwin, California. And it was as if I'd been there before. It was no different. People were performing it the same way. The modularity in their voice was the same, just as calm, just as professional, and our behaviors were identical. Why is that important? Because if you've been there before, you're better than had you not been there before. So this is why we train. It's so that when you engage that moment, your total focus is responding to the unique circumstances of that moment, rather than trying to master your weapon system or master your procedures. It was as if we'd been there before, which made us very good. Well, this is interesting because we knew that when we moved, as soon as we moved north, that we were going to move very fast. There's a whole bunch I could talk about on this point, but the maps were difficult to get. We were piecing together maps with special folds so that you could track your movements all the way forward. It's not like you were going to fight to Baghdad on one map sheet, because it was a good long distance. But while we were in the desert, technology injected itself. So as we're building all these maps, we were told that we were going to get this thing called Blue Force Tracker, which was going to be a TV screen that would have a digital map, and that when you slave your vehicle to it, it was just the map would move, the map sheet would move on the screen, which is a perfect aid to mission command and the ability to see yourself. So you see your vehicle on there, you see your other vehicles, and so in terms of frame of reference, it was a godsend, because we'd have been fighting map sheets. Now we had the map book that we created as backup in case the system went down, but that Blue Force Tracker gave us a real ability to move fast. Yeah, so the biggest issue at that point in time was being able to move fast and maintain the integrity of the brigade, get to our objectives. But an implied task in all of that is, if you're going to move fast, you got to be able to have the fuel to sustain it. And I remember Colonel Perkins at the time, he was concerned about this. He knew that we were going to be effective. He knew we were going to overcome and overmatch our enemy very easily. Anticipating that, he was anticipating, if I overcome the enemy very quickly, I expect that our senior leaders, once I reach my objective, are going to say, can you go further? Or can you get all the way to Baghdad? So his task to the staff was, I need enough fuel to get all the way to Baghdad. I don't want to have to rely on my boss to give me fuel to accomplish an objective he wants. So we worked very hard to get loads of fuel so that if asked, we could just keep on moving. There were certain constraints involved in all that, but one of the creative things that General Perkins directed, I'll never forget, very unconventional, was creativity and innovation at its best. He said, if the main consumers of fuel in a combat brigade, remember, a brigade consists not only of Bradleys and tanks, but also includes artillery pieces, it includes trucks, it includes Humvees, and all sorts of wheeled vehicles. But the main consumers are those Bradleys and tanks. And so what he said was, rather than take the circuitous route with the tanks and Bradleys, I will take the tanks and Bradleys over terrain, the shortest distance from A to B, and the rest of the vehicles will go, that are constrained to roads and more trafficable terrain, will go a different route. Now, if anybody who's been in combat, that might be of some concern, because you want, hopefully, those combat vehicles to protect the rest of the formation. So he said, no, we're going to take risk. We'll send the wheels a different direction. We'll send the tanks and Brads a very short distance. When we get to the destination, we'll shut down the vehicles, save fuel, and wait for you to catch up. So splitting that formation became a tactical risk, one that he prudently took, but so planning for that diversion, watching the tanks take off and go the short distance while I was going to stay on the road with the rest of the formation, was a significant event.
As the M1s made their way north and passed a lot of different towns and encampments, did that prove to be an effective strategy?
Well, it did, because we got further into Iraq more quickly, and we saved a significant amount of fuel. And I don't recall what the numbers were, but it was it had significant tactical effects for us. So when we rejoined the formation, one of the things I think about this time is we were traveling about 2.5, 3 days straight, very little sleep, because you're in a vehicle, it's moving, you got to stay awake. And so by the time we got to some initial objectives, sleep deprived, but then we had to try to get some sleep in order to continue to move. So that was a challenge, to get enough rest in order to continue to keep moving. In terms of the towns and the tanks and Bradleys, one of the things we found early on in some of the smaller towns down south is that the Bradleys and tanks had a fundamental effect psychologically on the villages that we would go through, and even the units that we would come in contact with, because they were so powerful and so effective and so accurate that the resistance would collapse fairly quickly in these towns. So rather than being afraid of the town, we would go into the towns where maybe some of these enemy vehicles or fighting positions were, and be able to be very accurate with fires, and the leadership of that unit would just collapse. So that's where the name Thunder Run began. And General Perkins would say, the next objective, he'd say, okay, let's run another Thunder Run right up the middle. And you would see these towns essentially collapse. I was in a Humvee at the time, so as the Brigade XO, I was leading the Brigade Tactical Operations Center, which was made up of a number of vehicles, but the essence of it was 3 tracked vehicles and 3 Humvees that would follow behind the formation in order to control fires. But at the time, we didn't have armored Humvees. They were made of fiberglass, had fiberglass doors, metal frames, regular glass windows, so a little bit more vulnerable than what we have now.
Do you guys take much fire?
You know, I do remember, that's actually a distinct memory. We avoided a lot of the direct fire because I was back just behind the formation leading the command post. But when you did take fire, this is the first thing I think so this was the second lesson. Your first lesson was, you know, I've been there before, you know, and that training effectiveness. But the other thing that I never knew, and nobody told me this, that when people shoot at you, it's very difficult to know where it's coming from. In the movies, it's easy to know where it's coming from because they're telling a story, and you always know where the fire is coming from. And the first time I saw this, I was in the command post. We were at a short stop. I was standing on a road next to a drainage ditch, and I was looking down at the ground, and I saw the dirt in front of me puff up like a puff of smoke, which was a bizarre thing to see, just spontaneously a puff of smoke. And it took me seconds to figure out that we were being shot at by a sniper, and you didn't know where it was coming from. That's an invigorating experience to suddenly make that realization. You know, those little lessons of combat. You don't know where, so then you're looking around, you're saying, where's it coming from? And nobody knows. Everybody's looking. So that was, yeah, so anyway. That was my first experience of being shot at. That's right. I guess I remember a time when we received our mortar rounds, actually. And, you know, you never know how you're going to react. For me, it was an adrenaline surge, and not a negative one. The negative emotions, I think, come later once you start to see the carnage that comes with war. This was a level of adrenaline that created, I don't want to say euphoria, but it was an inspiration or a motivation to do what you're trained to do. And so the energy level goes way up. You know, you're okay. I know this. I know how to deal with this, and we're going to get after it. So at the time with the mortar rounds, for example, you know, getting the counter battery radar in and maneuvering our forces so that we avoid the fires. But the other thing you realize is, what does running do? You know, if rounds are coming in, which are completely random, you know, all running does, and now there are times to run if you're getting to a point where you need to get under cover, but running just merely changes the equation of the random acts of rounds moving. And so you're really not, you know, unless you're getting to a specific destination for a reason, These are things that kind of strike you when it's happening. So I think there was a certain level of prudent anxiety that maximized your performance. That was my thought. Yes. So we were making progress, right? So, and just as a little bit of some perspective, one of the early campaign plans indicated that it would take us 120 days to get to the outskirts of Baghdad. This is April 5th, right? So this is a matter of weeks, short weeks. So we had crossed the river. We are now at the southern gates of Baghdad. So again, there's euphoria because you're achieving your objectives. You're still dominating. The brigade is together. You're still achieving what you were trained to do. But it wasn't over yet. And so this is April 5th, and we had been doing these thunder runs down south in small towns. We're now looking at a city of 5 to 6 million people. And do you do a thunder run in a city of 5 to 6 million people? And so General Perkins came back he'd been at 3rd Infantry Division TOC, came back after taking orders from General Blunt. He says, we're going to do a thunder run into Baghdad. So I'm like, all right, here we go. It's important to note that for months we'd been in Kuwait training. And the senior leaders of the brigade, in my case, General Perkins, also, Major Kevin Dunlop at the time, we would sit at dinner, and there's, after you're done training for the day, what do you talk about? Well, you talk about how you're going to take down Iraq, right? So one of the things I remember General Perkins saying, I think you put tanks on the steps of the palace and this place collapses. The government, at least, collapses. So we're at the gates of Baghdad, and we're going to do a thunder run. And so now we're starting to look at the opportunity to do what we dreamed about for months.
Were you concerned at all because taking tanks into an urban area isn't really in your doctrine?
That's correct. And in fact, the original plan was to surround Baghdad and to choke it off and to slowly quadrant the city, go in, clear it, come out, go in, clear it, come out, and slowly put pressure on this city in order to force the collapse of the government. Our thought was, General Perkins in particular, that the psychological effect, if you do it fast and hard, will be more effective than slowly doing it. Because here's one thing you find, and we saw the effects of this post-2003, is that after a while, people acclimate. The human condition is such that you acclimate to whatever it is. It doesn't matter how bad, whether you're in prison, if you're in slavery, if you're in, it's bad, but you acclimate. Look at how we are now. We've got all these luxuries, and sometimes we have a bad day. How can we have a bad day when you compare our life to maybe the way people lived 150 years ago when they were toiling physically for everything. So the body acclimates. And so the thought was that, General Perkins' thought was that if you just surround Baghdad and you slowly do this thing, they'll get used to you there. And then the resistance becomes more difficult. So shock was going to be important. So we anticipated this thunder run on the 5th. And the first one was just going to be right up the highway, dogleg to the left, and then the highway just doglegs left and right into the airport, which is again on the outskirts of Baghdad, where the brigade would link up with the 1st Brigade of the 3rd Infantry Division. And the other thing he said is that they would just do it with 1 battalion. So the 1st Battalion, 64th Armor, did an attack on the 5th. They were successful. There were a number of stories. You've probably talked to Colonel Helms about some of these and others. It was a tough fight, but overwhelmingly effective. And what General Perkins came back that evening to the talk, and he had a number of observations. He said, number one, he said, they are not defending the city well. We can go into the city without a problem and without hindrance. Secondly, he was more convinced than ever that we needed to go straight to the center of the gut of Baghdad, downtown palace area, and stay. And like a pit bull, just sink our teeth into the place, and that psychologically that would cause a collapse. Harkening back to 6 months earlier when he said, all you need to do is put a tank on the steps of Baghdad because the people in Baghdad have never seen an American tank before in their life. Well, so there's the Medellin division, there was a Hammurabi division. In both cases, they were not a strong competitor for a number of reasons that we could talk about. But it was apparent to me that a U.S. Army brigade could go through anything at that time. The Fedayeen, they were tenacious, and I think tenacious is probably a good word. They would continue to fight us, but we weren't at that time paying sufficient attention to that tenacity, which would later present itself months and years later. But at that point in time was not a factor for us. So our objective was to collapse the government of Baghdad. Well, sure. After a number of thunder runs in the south, and then when we did the one into the city on the 5th, based on everything that 1st Battalion, 64th Armor saw, I think it was apparent that they could penetrate this city, that it wasn't well defended, that we were better than the defenses that they had in place.
Now, walk me through April 7th. What were your experiences?
Well, the first thing I would tell you, though, is that on the 5th, General Perkins came back. He says, we're going to go back to Baghdad, and we're going to stay. What wasn't apparent when we wrote the order or what we didn't talk a lot about, when we wrote the order for the 7th, is I think there was an expectation that we were going to do the same thunder run and go back the same route through to the airport and continue to recon that area and get a sense of what was going on. In our case, General Perkins directed us to write an order that when we make that dogleg left, instead of continuing, move to the right and go right to the palaces and the government and downtown areas. And the idea was that if we could go there and stay, the place would collapse. If we could go there and we couldn't stay, we could always retrograde out. So the idea of staying was a relatively close-held secret within the brigade. And we did the order the night before on the 6th, and we brought in a few journalists and embargoed their reporting, so they knew the gig. And as the orders group was breaking up, we had some UAVs that were running the route, and we realized through these UAVs that they were putting in obstacles and obstacle belts. They had a pretty tough fight on the 5th, but they were able to penetrate. But now we've got obstacles going in. So after the op order, it was probably 9 o'clock at night, I went up to General Perkins. I said, it's a little problem. They're putting in obstacles along the route that we're depending on. He said, doesn't change the plan. We're going to continue to press. I said, okay, I got it, sir. But to what degree does the plan stay intact? At what point would you say, nope, we can't do it? And I remember him putting his finger into my chest and saying, Eric, we're going to Baghdad tomorrow. And I said, I got it, sir. We're going to Baghdad. I said, okay, give me the criteria then that would drive you to have us withdraw. If you're going, you say you're going to stay, there's got to be something that might make you think to withdraw so that we have conditions in place to synchronize this effort. And he gave me two that I recall. One was, he said, okay, look, we can only stay in Baghdad if we know that we can get resupply into Baghdad so we can get fuel, bullets, et cetera. So that's one. We need a resupply. We need a line of communication, or we call a lock, into Baghdad. The second one that he said that we needed the ability to command and control fires, Air Force, CAS, because you're going to have this 5,000-man brigade in the center of a city surrounded by 5 to 6 million people. You need the ability to protect it, secure it, et cetera. Command and control and resupply, those are the two things. The ironic thing about the 7th, when the attack happened, this time all 3 battalions went north. An old funny story. They went north. There was started to make the turn to the left, but then they left the highway and went towards the downtown area. And most of the people, I think, at the higher echelons were perplexed. You may have read this in Thunder Run, that this must be wrong. They weren't supposed to go down there. Why are they going down there? So there's a bit of confusion because we were taking this creative venture. But remember what I said. I said General Perkins said there's 2 criteria that would pull us out. Interestingly, both of those criteria were met. We lost the ability to command and control the brigade because a missile hit the command post, which is this nerve system of the brigade, the ability to bring in fires, CAS, Air Force, et cetera, was hit by an Ababil or Frog missile, I'm not sure which, destroyed the TOC. It was somewhat of an inferno. So we lost his command and control. And then not too far away from that moment, our resupply package with fuelers and bullets and sabot rounds and artillery rounds, all of that was being run towards Baghdad, and it was ambushed partway up and was incinerated. So we lost our fuel, lost our ammunition, and lost our command and control. What were those? Those were criteria to pull out of Baghdad. And commander got on the net, talked to the division commander, and said, you know what? We are secure here in downtown Baghdad. I'm convinced that I can hold it. I recommend I stay here and hold the downtown capital of Baghdad. So what's the lesson there? The lesson is you can put together all the detailed plans and all the criteria that drive the behavior and performance of your commands. But in the end, a commander makes an instinctive decision based on the feel of the battlefield. He was in the center of Baghdad. He knew he could hold it. So then it became up to us to put that command and control back together. It was up to us now to somehow get resupply back in, all of which we ultimately did. But that's an example of a commander instinctively feeling the nature of the dynamics of the ground, who had momentum, where the decisive point was, and that we were crossing it.
So that sounded like a close call. Could you feel the explosion? Did it knock you down?
Unbelievable energy. That was probably the memory I had from that. So really what I was doing at the time, we'd gotten to a point where the boss was in Baghdad, the battalions had settled down, we were securing the area, things were settling down a little bit, fights here and there, but it was settling down. And so there was a pause in the conflict, and I wanted to call the boss, and so I called him on a secure satellite phone, and I wanted to congratulate him. And I said to him, I said, sir, it's everything we'd been dreaming about. It's everything we were talking about for the last 6 months. And right at that time, I hear this like an airplane flying over, but at hypersonic speed. So I'd heard jets fly, quite often. That wasn't an unusual sound, but the rate of that hollowing sound was a lot faster. And in a split second, I heard that sound, thought that's odd, it's at a different rate, and then the world turned upside down. And what I found with the energy that comes with that explosion is ungodly, unbelievable. So much so that the shock of the blast put me on the ground and probably it stunned me for moments. Hearing is shot. There's fire everywhere. A young warrior, not from me to that wall, literally cut in half by shrapnel. So the random effects of the power of the energy of that weapon, knowing that you are just right there, why does that happen? Why does that happen? And you ask these questions. But yeah, powerful, powerful energy I'd never experienced in my life. And then you saw soldiers get after the business of the courageous individuals that they are. A really, really bad thing just happened. We had 23 vehicles destroyed. There was 23 severely wounded soldiers. 5 people were killed, as I recall. So that's a really bad day, right? But to watch about 100 soldiers or so come together I just started going around giving them 3 things to, secure the area, evacuate the wounded, reestablish command and control. And I just go around. I was finding NCOs, and that's what I would tell them to do. And they were doing it, And I remember seeing a warrant officer without a helmet on, driving a M577, which is a command post, mechanized carrier command post configuration, driving through a wall of flame and then later driving through a concrete wall with the tents that were attached to this thing that we had been under prior to that, doing command and control, with those things flapping behind as he was driving it through fire and through another wall just to get much of our equipment out of the inferno as possible. Heroic acts like that, but everybody was doing something. And then I watched them over the course of the next hour reconfigure piece by piece wires and cables to get command post back up again.
One missile.
It was very devastating. The crater was probably half the size of this room, and went about 10 feet deep. And powerful hit. So it wasn't an artillery round. It wasn't a mortar round. We think it was either an Abigail or Frog missile at the time. No, but I think that the amazing aspect of that whole thing was the creative leadership of a great brigade commander, the capacity of a well-trained brigade that performed phenomenally because they're great soldiers, great warriors, but because they were trained well, they knew their craft and were confident in it. And then to see you achieve a national objective was a powerful, powerful experience.